On July 24, 1965, 4 F-4C Phantoms were flying escort for a strike force northwest of Hanoi when the warning came too late. A Soviet-built SA-2 surface-to-air missile, accelerating to 3 times the speed of sound, slammed into one of the Phantoms. The aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and twisted metal. Captains Roscoe Faubert and Richard Kean ejected into enemy territory. Kean would eventually be released after nearly 8 years of captivity. Faubert was killed in the shootdown, and his remains were not recovered until 1998. The other 3 Phantoms limped home, their fuselages riddled with shrapnel from the same missile battery. In a single engagement lasting less than a minute, the most advanced Soviet air defense technology had demonstrated that American pilots were no longer masters of the skies over North Vietnam. Soviet military advisors watching from the ground were satisfied. Their weapons worked exactly as designed. The SA-2 guideline missile system had already proven itself against the high-flying U-2 reconnaissance aircraft 5 years earlier. Now it was proving equally lethal against frontline American fighters operating at combat altitudes. Pentagon officials were stunned. Within months, dozens of American aircraft would fall from the sky, and the confidence that had characterized American air operations would be shattered. What the Soviets did not anticipate was the American response. Within 5 months, a small group of volunteer pilots would begin flying missions so audacious, so seemingly suicidal, that Soviet advisors at the missile sites would watch in disbelief as American aircraft did the unthinkable. These American pilots would deliberately fly toward the missile batteries. They would bait the SAM operators into tracking them with their targeting radars. They would wait until the missiles launched, watch the telephone pole-sized weapons streak toward their aircraft at 3 times the speed of sound, and then at the last possible moment attempt to outmaneuver them while simultaneously attacking the sites that had just tried to kill them. The Soviets had never seen anything like it. No rational pilot would deliberately make himself a target for the most lethal air defense system on Earth. Every principle of aerial warfare dictated that aircraft should avoid surface-to-air missiles, not actively seek them out. But these were not ordinary pilots. They called themselves Wild Weasels, and their motto, born from the first briefing, where the insane mission was explained to potential volunteers, would define one of the most dangerous flying assignments in aviation history. To understand why American pilots would volunteer for what appeared to be a suicide mission, you have to understand what happened in the skies over North Vietnam between 1965 and 1973. You have to understand how Soviet technology nearly won the air war, and you have to understand the desperate gamble that changed everything. The SA-2 guideline was not a new weapon when it arrived in North Vietnam. Soviet engineers had begun developing the system in 1953 under the direction of Petr Grushin at the Lavochkin Design Bureau. The original purpose was straightforward and driven by Cold War necessity. American Strategic Air Command B-52 bombers could fly higher than any Soviet fighter could effectively intercept them. These massive aircraft, carrying thermonuclear weapons, could penetrate Soviet airspace with near impunity. The SA-2 was designed to reach those bombers where fighters could not. The missile stood 35 feet tall and weighed over 5,000 pounds at launch. A solid fuel booster kicked it off the launch rail with a distinctive roar and cloud of smoke, and then a liquid fuel second stage ignited to accelerate it to Mach 3 as it climbed toward its target. The warhead carried approximately 430 pounds of high explosive in a blast fragmentation configuration, enough to destroy any aircraft with a direct hit or near miss. The effective range reached approximately 20 miles, and the missile could engage targets up to 60,000 feet in altitude. At lower altitudes, where aircraft could maneuver more effectively, the missile's guidance system struggled to track rapid changes in direction. The system required 2 radars to function. The spoon rest acquisition radar scanned the sky for approaching aircraft, its rotating antenna sweeping in continuous circles, feeding targeting data to the battery's computer. When a potential target was identified, operators would alert the guidance section and prepare for engagement. The fan-song guidance radar then took over, its distinctive emissions locking onto the target aircraft and tracking both it and the missile after launch, sending continuous corrections to keep them on an intercept course. American electronic intelligence specialists quickly learned to recognize both radar signatures, and the distinctive warbling tone of the fan's song became a sound that haunted pilots' nightmares. A typical SA-2 site consisted of 6 launchers arranged in a hexagonal pattern, each capable of holding a missile ready for immediate launch. The central control van housed the operators who monitored radar displays and calculated firing solutions. Nearby, additional vans contained the fire control computers and communications equipment that linked the site to the broader air defense network. Revetments protected the equipment from blast effects, and camouflage netting concealed the installations from aerial reconnaissance. The crews operating these sites were professionals. Soviet advisors had trained them extensively, and the North Vietnamese had proven adept students. They knew their equipment intimately. They understood the capabilities and limitations of the SA-2, and they were highly motivated to destroy the American aircraft that were bombing their country. On May 1, 1960, the SA-2 had demonstrated its capabilities to the world when a missile battery near Sverdlovsk shot down Francis Gary Powers in his CIA U-2 spyplane. Powers had been flying at 70,000 feet, an altitude previously considered safe from any ground-based weapon. The SA-2 reached him anyway. The incident humiliated the United States, derailed a planned summit between President Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Khrushchev, and ended any doubt about Soviet air defense capabilities. Powers survived the shootdown and was captured, creating an international incident that reverberated for years. 2 years later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, another SA-2 shot down a U-2 piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson over Cuba. Anderson was killed instantly. The shootdown nearly triggered nuclear war, as President Kennedy had previously stated that any attack on American aircraft would result in retaliation against the missile sites. Cooler heads prevailed, but the incident underscored the SA-2's strategic significance. By 1965, the Soviets had deployed the SA-2 to every Warsaw Pact nation and were actively exporting it to client states around the world. More than 600 sites protected the Soviet homeland alone. When North Vietnam requested assistance against American air power, which was beginning to conduct sustained bombing operations against targets throughout the country, Moscow agreed to provide the system along with the technicians and advisors needed to operate it. Approximately 1,000 Soviet military specialists arrived in North Vietnam in April 1965. They wore North Vietnamese uniforms to hide their nationality from American intelligence and began constructing the first SAM sites in a ring around Hanoi and Haiphong, the country's most important cities and the centers of its war effort. American reconnaissance detected the construction almost immediately. On April 5, 1965, photographs taken by high-flying reconnaissance aircraft revealed 5 SAM sites under construction. The distinctive 6-pointed star pattern of launch rails surrounding central guidance equipment was unmistakable. American military commanders wanted to destroy them immediately, before they became operational. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara refused. He feared that killing Soviet advisors, who were almost certainly present at the construction sites, might escalate the conflict and draw Moscow into direct confrontation with the United States. The sites were placed off-limits to American attack aircraft. The decision haunted American pilots for years. By the time the first missiles launched in July, the sites had been completed, manned, integrated into an air defense network, and calibrated against American aircraft. The North Vietnamese and their Soviet advisors had used the 3 months of immunity to perfect their procedures and position additional sites throughout the country. American pilots entering North Vietnamese airspace in the summer of 1965 had no countermeasures, no warning systems, and no established tactics for dealing with the new threat. They had never faced modern surface-to-air missiles in combat. They learned through trial and error, and the errors were often fatal. In the first months, the only defense was visual detection of the missile's launch plume and violent evasive maneuvering. Pilots called it dancing with death. When they spotted the distinctive white smoke trail rising from the jungle below, they had seconds to react. The standard technique was to wait until the missile was committed to its intercept course, then execute a high G brake toward it at the last possible moment. The missile, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, could not match the sudden change in direction required to follow an aircraft turning sharply toward the sun or diving for the deck. If timed correctly, the SAM would streak past harmlessly, unable to correct its trajectory in time. If timed incorrectly, the pilot died. The psychological burden was enormous. Pilots flying toward Hanoi knew they were entering the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. They knew that at any moment, without warning, a missile might appear below them, its smoke trail the only indication that death was seconds away. They knew that even if they evaded the SAMs, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, ranging from small-caliber automatic weapons to heavy 85mm cannons, waited to finish what the missiles started. The stress of operating in this environment took a toll that extended far beyond physical casualties. Something had to be done. The Air Force began searching for a solution. In the summer of 1965, Brigadier General Kenneth Dempster was given command of a classified program to develop dedicated SAM suppression aircraft. The project was originally called Ferret, after the animal known for pursuing prey into its den and killing it there. The name was quickly changed to Wild Weasel to avoid confusion with World War II-era radar countermeasures aircraft that had used the same codename. The concept was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. A specially equipped aircraft would fly ahead of strike formations into enemy territory, essentially offering itself as bait. Using electronic sensors designed to detect and locate radar emissions, it would identify the positions of SAM sites by the distinctive signatures of their guidance radars. Then it would attack and destroy the sites before they could launch missiles at the main strike force following behind. The problem was that the sensors worked best when the aircraft flew directly toward the radar source. The bearing to a radar could be determined fairly easily, but determining the range required flying toward it and watching how the signal strength changed. This meant flying straight at the SAM sites while they were actively tracking and preparing to fire. It meant deliberately becoming a target for the most lethal weapon system American pilots had ever faced. When the program briefers explained the mission concept to potential volunteers, one electronic warfare officer from the B-52 community summarized what everyone was thinking. Captain Jack Donovan, a veteran who had spent years in the relative safety of high-altitude strategic bombers, far from enemy defenses, listened to the briefing with growing incredulity. When the briefers finished, his response would become legend. "You want me to fly in the back of a little tiny fighter aircraft with a crazy fighter pilot who thinks he's invincible, home in on a SAM site in North Vietnam, and shoot it before it shoots me? You gotta be kidding me." His actual words were considerably more colorful and included profanity that cannot be repeated here. The acronym YGBSM, officially standing for "You gotta be kidding me" in its polite version, became the unofficial motto of every Wild Weasel crew that followed. It appeared on squadron patches, ready room walls, and the personal gear of men who flew into fire that everyone else was desperately trying to avoid. Despite the apparent insanity of the mission, volunteers stepped forward. The Air Force had asked for crazy men willing to fly suicide missions, and crazy men answered the call. The first crews were selected in September 1965 and gathered at a remote, heavily secured section of Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. 10 aviators, 5 pilots, and 5 electronic warfare officers began training on equipment that was literally still being installed in their aircraft as they learned to use it. The first Wild Weasel platform was the F-100F Super Sabre, a 2-seat version of the Air Force's first supersonic fighter. The aircraft was nearly a decade old by 1965 and no longer flew first-line combat missions, but it was available. It had a back seat for an electronic warfare officer, and time was critical. Technicians working around the clock installed an APR-25 radar homing and warning receiver borrowed from the CIA's U-2 program, along with a WR-300 launch detection receiver designed to alert crews when a missile had been fired at them. A small cathode ray tube display in each cockpit showed the direction to detected radar signals. The installation was crude by any standard, using commercial-grade wiring and off-the-shelf components rushed from suppliers who had no idea what their products would be used for. But the equipment worked, and the first aircraft was ready to fly in just 10 days. 3 more F-100Fs followed in rapid succession. By mid-November, barely 2 months after the program began, the Wild Weasels were committed to combat. 4 F-100Fs departed for Southeast Asia on Thanksgiving Day 1965, arriving at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base after a turbulent trans-Pacific flight that tested both the aircraft and the crews. 84 days had passed since the first aircraft rolled into the hangar for modification. Now the untested equipment and unproven tactics would face the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. The first missions were reconnaissance flights near the Laotian border, designed to gather electronic intelligence and allow crews to familiarize themselves with the environment and their equipment. They called it trolling for SAMs, flying provocative profiles that would encourage the North Vietnamese to activate their radars and reveal their positions. The crews listened to the distinctive sounds of enemy radar emissions in their headsets, learning to distinguish between search radars, merely scanning the sky, and tracking radars actively, preparing to guide missiles. On December 20th, 1965, the first true Wild Weasel combat mission launched against known SAM sites in North Vietnam. It went badly. The flight encountered heavy opposition, and one aircraft was lost along with its crew. The North Vietnamese were not going to give up their air defense advantage without a fight. 2 days later, on December 22nd, Captain Alan Lamb and Captain Jack Donovan climbed into their F-100F to lead another mission. Lamb was a remarkable aviator with an extraordinary personal history that seemed to prepare him uniquely for the Wild Weasel mission. He had survived ejection from a burning B-29 during training before the Korean War, one of only 2 crew members to escape the doomed aircraft. He had bailed out of a B-26 over Korea after anti-aircraft fire damaged his aircraft during a combat mission. He had later become one of only 7 American military pilots to survive a supersonic ejection from a jet fighter after his aircraft became uncontrollable. If anyone could handle the unpredictable and extreme dangers of the Wild Weasel mission, it was Alan Lamb. The flight consisted of Lamb and Donovan in their F-100F, leading 4 F-105D Thunderchiefs, armed with bombs and rockets. As they approached the target area near Yen Bai, approximately 75 miles northwest of Hanoi, Donovan began detecting radar emissions on his instruments. He called out bearings and signal characteristics, while Lamb maneuvered the aircraft to triangulate the position of the emitting radar. They found the SAM site camouflaged in the jungle, its distinctive 6-pointed star arrangement of launchers surrounding the central guidance radar van that controlled the entire battery. Lamb rolled in and attacked with 2.75-inch unguided rockets and 20mm cannon fire, his rounds walking across the site and destroying the radar van, along with a nearby missile still sitting on its launcher. The 4 Thunderchiefs following behind finished off the remaining equipment with their heavier ordnance. The message sent to the Pentagon after they landed entered Wild Weasel legend. Weasel sighted SAM, killed same. The concept was validated. Wild Weasels could find and destroy SAM sites. American strike aircraft could operate more safely with dedicated defense suppression aircraft preceding them. But the cost of this new capability would be staggering. The early Wild Weasel operations proved deadly. 2 F-100Fs were shot down in combat during the initial deployment, and the aircraft's limitations became painfully clear. The remaining aircraft suffered from maintenance problems and combat damage that reduced their effectiveness. Of the crews who flew the early missions, several were killed or captured, others were wounded badly enough to require evacuation, and some requested reassignment after witnessing the toll the mission exacted. The F-100F was simply too slow and too limited to survive in the environment around Hanoi. It lacked the speed to keep up with the F-105 Thunderchiefs that carried the primary strike mission, and its weapons load was insufficient to destroy hardened SAM sites with their buried cables and reinforced bunkers. A new aircraft was needed immediately. The Air Force selected the F-105F, a 2-seat version of the powerful Thunderchief strike fighter that was already bearing the brunt of the bombing campaign. The F-105 was the largest single-seat, single-engine combat aircraft ever built, weighing 50,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel and weapons. It could exceed the speed of sound at sea level with afterburner and reach Mach 2 at high altitude. Its Pratt & Whitney J75 engine, produced over 24,000 pounds of thrust, with afterburner engaged. More importantly, it could carry up to 14,000 pounds of weapons on external pylons and an internal weapons bay, giving Wild Weasel crews the firepower they needed to kill SAM sites. Republic Aviation had begun development of the Thunderchief in 1951 as a supersonic nuclear strike aircraft designed to penetrate Soviet air defenses and deliver atomic weapons against targets deep in enemy territory. The aircraft incorporated area rule design principles that gave it a distinctive wasp waist fuselage, reducing transonic drag and allowing higher speeds. Wing root air intakes fed the massive engine, while leaving the nose free for radar and targeting equipment. The F-105 entered service in 1958 and quickly proved itself as a capable strike platform. When American involvement in Vietnam escalated in 1964 and 1965, the Thunderchief became the primary attack aircraft for operations over North Vietnam. Its range, speed, and payload capacity made it ideal for the long missions from Thai bases to targets around Hanoi. Pilots called it the Thud, a nickname that began as an insult, referencing the sound the aircraft supposedly made when it crashed. The F-105 had a troubled early service life with numerous accidents, and some pilots viewed it with suspicion. Over time, as the aircraft proved itself in the most dangerous skies on Earth, the name became one of respect and affection. Colonel Jack Broughton, an F-105 pilot who flew over 100 missions over North Vietnam, later wrote that the Thud had justified herself, and the name that was originally spoken with a sneer has become one of utmost respect through the air fraternity. The first F-105F Wild Weasels arrived at Korat in May 1966. They were designated Wild Weasel 3, following the unsuccessful Wild Weasel 2 program that had attempted to adapt the F-4C Phantom for the mission. The F-105F was equipped with the APR-25 and APR-26 radar warning receivers, the IR-133 panoramic receiver for broader frequency coverage, and most importantly, the AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile. The Shrike was a modified Sparrow air-to-air missile redesigned to home on radar emissions rather than aircraft. The Navy had developed it specifically for the SAM suppression role. When a SAM site's fan-song radar illuminated a Wild Weasel aircraft, the Shrike could track the signal back to its source and destroy the radar antenna and associated equipment. The missile carried a 149-pound warhead, sufficient to knock out the guidance system and render the site combat ineffective, even if the launchers and missiles themselves survived. For the first time, Wild Weasel crews had a weapon that allowed them to attack SAM sites from beyond the range of the missiles themselves. They no longer had to fly directly over the sites to drop unguided bombs and rockets. They could fire from a distance, potentially outside the SA-2's engagement envelope, and evade while the Shrike tracked its target. The equation had shifted. The new capabilities fundamentally changed the tactical picture. Wild Weasels could now precede strike formations into heavily defended areas, engage the SAM sites with Shrikes to destroy or suppress them, and keep them suppressed while the bombers attacked their primary targets. If the SAM operators turned off their radars to avoid the Shrikes, they could not guide their missiles and became combat ineffective. If they kept the radars on to engage the incoming aircraft, they risked destruction by anti-radiation missiles. Either way, the Wild Weasels won. The crews developed tactics that exploited every advantage their equipment and training provided. They learned to read the subtle differences in radar signals that indicated whether a site was merely searching or actively preparing to launch. They learned the timing of the SA-2 engagement sequence, the approximately 30 seconds between radar lock and missile launch, during which the operators were completing their targeting solution. They learned to predict which sites would fire based on their behavior and which were bluffing, turning on their radars to force American aircraft to take evasive action without actually launching missiles. The Wild Weasel motto expanded to include first in, last out. They preceded the strike formations into enemy territory, often flying 10 or 15 minutes ahead of the main force to locate and engage air defenses. They remained after the bombers departed, keeping the SAM sites suppressed until every friendly aircraft was safely away from the threat zone. Missions often lasted more than 3.5 hours, with crews exposed to enemy defenses for extended periods, while other pilots made single-pass attacks and returned to base. By 1967, the air war over North Vietnam had reached a brutal intensity that exceeded anything seen since World War II. American aircraft flew hundreds of sorties daily against targets throughout the country as Operation Rolling Thunder attempted to pressure the North Vietnamese government into negotiations. The North Vietnamese responded by constructing the most formidable integrated air defense system the world had ever seen. Soviet advisors continued to arrive, eventually numbering more than 8,000 according to some estimates. They brought not only SA-2 missiles and their associated equipment but also advanced anti-aircraft artillery, improved radar systems, and MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighter aircraft, flown by Vietnamese pilots trained in the Soviet Union. Chinese advisors supplemented the Soviet presence, providing additional training and equipment from their own stockpiles. By the end of Operation Rolling Thunder in October 1968, North Vietnam possessed approximately 7,500 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers and 200 active SAM sites. The sites were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire around critical targets, so that aircraft attacking one site would enter the engagement envelope of several others. American pilots flying toward Hanoi had to penetrate multiple rings of defenses, any one of which could prove fatal. The terrain itself added to the danger. Pilots approaching Hanoi from Thailand had to cross a mountainous region they called Thud Ridge, a series of hills running parallel to the Red River, approximately 30 miles northwest of Hanoi. The Tam Dao mountain range provided the only significant terrain masking in the area. Once past Thud Ridge, strike aircraft descended into a valley dominated by enemy defenses. The ridgeline behind them cut off escape routes. The only way out was forward, through the defenses, or a long, curving flight that extended exposure time to unacceptable levels. The North Vietnamese understood the terrain as well as the Americans did. They positioned their defenses accordingly. SAM sites on the far side of Thud Ridge could engage aircraft as they crested the ridgeline and began their approach to targets around Hanoi. Anti-aircraft guns in the valley below waited to engage aircraft, forced down to low altitude by SAM evasion maneuvers. It was a killing ground, and everyone who flew there knew it. The Wild Weasels bore the brunt of this defensive network. Their mission required them to expose themselves to fire that other pilots tried desperately to avoid. They flew toward the threats, while everyone else flew away from them. They deliberately provoked enemy radar operators into revealing their positions, knowing that those same operators were calculating firing solutions against their aircraft. On March 10, 1967, Major Merlyn Dethlefsen demonstrated what Wild Weasel courage looked like under the worst possible circumstances. He was flying number 3 in a 4-ship formation assigned to suppress SAM defenses around the Thai Nguyen Steelworks, North Vietnam's only steel mill, and one of its most heavily defended targets. The target had been off-limits for political reasons during most of Rolling Thunder, but it was finally approved for attack as American policy shifted towards striking industrial targets. As the formation approached the target area, they encountered intense anti-aircraft fire from the numerous guns positioned to protect the steelworks. The flight leader engaged a SAM site that was preparing to fire, but his aircraft was hit and shot down before he could complete his attack. The number 2 aircraft took severe flak damage and had to withdraw, trailing smoke and struggling to maintain altitude. That left Dethlefsen and his wingman to deal with the SAM sites, protecting one of the most heavily defended targets in North Vietnam. As Dethlefsen dove to attack a site, 2 MiG-21 fighters jumped him from behind. The supersonic Soviet-built interceptors had him dead to rights. He evaded 2 air-to-air missiles by diving into the anti-aircraft fire zone, betting that the MiGs would not follow him into their own flak. The gamble worked. The MiG pilots, unwilling to fly through their own air defenses, broke off the pursuit. Dethlefsen then made 5 separate attack passes on the SAM sites, facing fire from 96 anti-aircraft artillery positions and continuous missile threats. His aircraft was riddled with damage from near misses and shell fragments. His electronic warfare officer, Captain Kevin Gilroy, maintained a steady stream of targeting information despite the chaos around them, calling out threats and providing the precise bearings Dethlefsen needed to press his attacks. On his final pass, Dethlefsen destroyed 2 SAM sites with bombs, cluster munitions, and 20mm cannon fire from the Vulcan rotary cannon mounted in his aircraft's nose. His actions allowed the main strike force of 72 fighter bombers to hit the steelworks without losing a single aircraft to SAMs. The mission was a success because one pilot refused to quit. 11 months later, President Lyndon Johnson presented Dethlefsen with the Medal of Honor at the White House. Gilroy received the Air Force Cross. When asked about his actions, Dethlefsen gave a response typical of Wild Weasel crews, men who routinely did extraordinary things and refused to acknowledge them as anything special. All I did was the job I was sent to do. 5 weeks after Dethlefsen's mission, another Wild Weasel pilot earned the Medal of Honor in circumstances even more extraordinary. On April 19, 1967, Major Leo Thorsness led a Wild Weasel flight on a SAM suppression mission near Hanoi. His electronic warfare officer was Captain Harold Johnson. The flight consisted of 3 F-105F Weasels and 1 F-105D single-seater using the call sign Kingfish. Thorsness located 2 SAM sites and attacked both in quick succession, destroying one with a Shrike missile that homed on its guidance radar and the other with cluster bombs that saturated the site with fragments. During the attack on the second site, his wingman was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft went down trailing flame and smoke, and both crew members ejected into enemy territory. Thorsness circled the descending parachutes to keep track of his downed comrades and relay their precise position to search and rescue forces. The crews in those parachutes were completely vulnerable, and North Vietnamese ground forces would try to capture them before helicopters could arrive. While he was circling, protecting his friends, a MiG-17 appeared, setting up a gunnery pass on the parachutes. The enemy pilot intended to kill the helpless Americans as they descended. Thorsness attacked immediately, ignoring his fuel state and tactical situation. He closed on the MiG and opened fire with his 20mm cannon, shooting down the enemy fighter before it could complete its attack. His downed comrades reached the ground safely. His fuel was now critically low after the extended combat and the maneuvering required to protect the parachutes. He located an aerial tanker and took on enough fuel to return to the area and continue protecting his downed wingman. When he learned that rescue helicopters were orbiting near the ejected crew and that additional MiGs were approaching to attack the vulnerable helicopters, Thorsness returned to the fight despite having expended most of his ordnance. He engaged 4 MiG-17 seconds with his cannon, damaging one and driving the others away from the rescue operation. His presence kept the enemy fighters at bay, while the helicopters attempted to recover the downed crew. By this point, his aircraft had only 500 rounds of ammunition remaining, and his fuel was again critically low. He finally departed the area and headed for the nearest friendly airfield at Udon, Thailand. 70 miles from base, his fuel gauges showed empty. Thorsness pulled the throttle to idle and glided toward the runway, trading altitude for distance at approximately 2 miles per 1,000 feet of altitude. Just as he touched down, his engine flamed out from fuel exhaustion. He had nothing left in his tanks. Minutes later would have meant ejecting into the jungle short of the runway. 11 days later, on his 93rd mission, Thorsness was shot down by a MiG-21 and captured. He spent nearly 6 years as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam, including extended periods of torture and solitary confinement in prisons with names like the Hanoi Hilton, Heartbreak Hotel, and the Zoo. The Medal of Honor was approved during his captivity, but not announced publicly until his release in March 1973. Military officials feared that revealing the award might lead to increased mistreatment by his captors, who would use the recognition to single him out for special attention. Thorsness learned of the nomination through coded messages tapped on his cell walls by fellow prisoners, a secret communication system the Americans had developed to maintain contact and morale. President Richard Nixon presented the Medal of Honor to Thorsness on October 15, 1973, after his release during Operation Homecoming. Captain Harold Johnson received the Air Force Cross for the same mission. Thorsness remained in the Air Force until injuries sustained during his high-speed ejection and aggravated by years of torture forced his medical retirement. He later served 1 term in the Washington State Senate and became a motivational speaker, sharing lessons learned from his years of combat and captivity. He published an autobiography titled Surviving Hell about his POW experience. He died on May 2, 2017, at age 85, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The war continued after Thorsness was captured, and the Wild Weasels continued to fly. By 1972, when Operation Linebacker brought American bombers back to the skies over Hanoi after a 4-year bombing halt, the tactics and technology had evolved considerably. The Wild Weasels now operated in sophisticated hunter-killer teams, with F-105Gs working alongside F-4 Phantoms to maximize their combat effectiveness. The Weasels would locate and engage SAM sites with their specialized equipment and Shrike missiles, while the Phantoms followed up with cluster bombs and other ordnance to finish off launchers and equipment that survived the initial WD attack. The coordination required precise timing and absolute trust between crews who often had never met before flying together into combat. During Linebacker 2, the intensive bombing campaign conducted in December 1972 against targets in and around Hanoi, Wild Weasels provided crucial support for B-52 strikes. The massive 8-engine bombers were exactly what the SA-2 had been designed to destroy, and the North Vietnamese launched everything they had against them. The North Vietnamese fired over 1,000 SA-2 missiles during Operation Linebacker 2, yet downed only 15 B-52 bombers and approximately a dozen tactical aircraft. Against the B-52 seconds alone, it took roughly 68 missile launches to achieve each kill, a ratio that reflected the accumulated expertise of Wild Weasel crews and the electronic countermeasures they had helped develop over 7 years of combat. The SA-2 system that had seemed invincible in 1965 was now struggling to achieve kills against aircraft that understood its limitations and exploited them ruthlessly. The last Wild Weasel missions over North Vietnam were flown in January 1973, as the Paris Peace Accords brought American combat involvement to a close. The crews that flew those final missions were the inheritors of a tradition established 7 years earlier by Alan Lamb, Jack Donovan, and the original volunteers who had answered the call for what seemed like certain death. 46 Wild Weasel, phone 105 seconds, and 2 F-100Fs were lost in combat during the Vietnam War. The toll among crews was proportionally devastating. A saying circulated among Thud pilots that by your 66th mission, you would have been shot down twice and picked up once. For Wild Weasels, who faced even greater exposure to enemy fire than ordinary strike pilots, the odds were worse. The mathematics were stark. A standard combat tour was 100 missions over North Vietnam. Wild Weasel crews calculated their survival odds based on loss rates that everyone tried not to think about too often. Every mission was a roll of the dice. Some crews were shot down multiple times and rescued. Others went down on their first mission and spent years in captivity. The randomness of combat did not discriminate between veterans and newcomers, between the skilled and the merely competent. A single piece of shrapnel in the wrong place, a SAM detonating a few feet closer, a split-second delay in evasive maneuvering, and the mission became the last. The electronic warfare officers who flew in the back seats of Wild Weasel aircraft faced particular psychological challenges. They had no control over the aircraft. They could not fly, could not maneuver, could not do anything when a SAM was headed their way except trust their pilot and watch their instruments. Their job was to find the threats and call them out, then hope their pilot could evade while simultaneously attacking. Many EWOs described the experience as the most intense of their lives, hours of focused concentration punctuated by moments of absolute terror. A Soviet general who served with North Vietnamese Air Defense Forces later revealed that the Soviets had provided 98 missile systems and 7,500 missiles during the war. At war's end, only 45 operational sites and 2,300 missiles remained. The difference represented the cumulative work of Wild Weasel crews and the strike aircraft they protected. But numbers tell only part of the story. Wild Weasels did more than destroy SAM sites. They fundamentally altered the calculus of air defense in North Vietnam. The mere presence of specialized defense suppression aircraft in a strike package reduced the effectiveness of enemy air defenses, even when no missiles were fired. SAM operators knew that activating their radars made them targets, and that knowledge forced hesitation at critical moments. Soviet advisors who had trained North Vietnamese crews reported that morale at SAM sites suffered significantly when Wild Weasels were known to be operating. The hunters had become the hunted. The weapon system that was supposed to sweep American aircraft from the sky was itself being systematically eliminated. The legacy of the Vietnam Wild Weasels extended far beyond that conflict. The tactics, technologies, and doctrines they developed became the foundation for suppression of enemy air defenses, known as SEAD, that remains central to American military operations today. When American forces went to war against Iraq in January 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, Wild Weasels led the way. F-4G Phantoms, the advanced successors to the F-105G, preceded strike formations into Iraqi airspace. They faced one of the most formidable air defense networks assembled since North Vietnam, and they systematically dismantled it within days. During Desert Storm, Wild Weasel crews employed tactics developed over Hanoi more than 2 decades earlier. One technique, nicknamed Here, Kitty Kitty, involved having one weasel attract the attention of a SAM site while others approached from behind and destroyed it before the operators realized they had been flanked. The same aggressive, counterintuitive approach that had shocked Soviet advisors in 1966 proved equally effective against Iraqi defenses supplied by the same Soviet Union. The original Wild Weasel aircraft are gone now, replaced by modern systems with capabilities that would have seemed miraculous to the crews who flew over North Vietnam. The F-16 CJ Block 50 and 52 aircraft, currently assigned to the SEAD mission, carry AGM-88 HARM missiles that can engage targets at ranges far beyond what the early Shrikes could achieve. Pilots perform both flying and targeting duties that once required a dedicated electronic warfare officer. The F-35 Lightning II promises to further revolutionize the mission through stealth technology that may allow SEAD aircraft to penetrate enemy defenses without being detected at all. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. To suppress enemy air defenses, someone has to fly into the teeth of those defenses and make themselves a target. Someone has to take the risk that no algorithm, stealth technology, or standoff weapon can completely eliminate. Someone has to be willing to accept danger that others avoid so that the mission can be accomplished. The men who volunteered for the first Wild Weasel missions understood this. They knew the odds. They knew that the mission parameters virtually guaranteed casualties among crews who flew it, and they went anyway, because the alternative was to abandon their fellow pilots to the SAMs. Alan Lamb, the pilot who scored the first Wild Weasel kill, survived the war and continued to live an extraordinary life. That first successful attack on December 22, 1965, validated the entire Wild Weasel concept and proved that American ingenuity could counter Soviet technology. As of 2024, Lamb was still living at 92 years old, having survived not only his combat experiences but also a brain bleed, COVID-19 complications, and numerous other medical challenges that would have killed lesser men. His wife Frances noted that he was like a cat with 9 lives, having survived supersonic ejection, multiple combat tours, shrapnel wounds, and decades of accumulated close calls. Jack Donovan, the electronic warfare officer, whose profane reaction to the Wild Weasel mission briefing became the program's unofficial motto, completed his combat tour and returned home. His words continued to echo through every Wild Weasel ready room for generations, a reminder of both the insanity and the necessity of what these crews did. Leo Thorsness died in 2017, having lived long enough to see the mission he helped define become a permanent part of American military doctrine. Merlyn Dethlefsen continued to serve his country after Vietnam, eventually retiring from the Air Force, his Medal of Honor, a testament to what one pilot could accomplish when he refused to accept impossible odds. The Wild Weasels proved that courage and audacity could overcome technological superiority. They demonstrated that the human element remained decisive even in an era of guided missiles and electronic warfare. They showed that American pilots would fly into fire that any rational calculation suggested they should avoid, because duty demanded nothing less. Soviet advisors never stopped being surprised by what the Wild Weasels did. The concept violated every principle of tactical aviation as they understood it. Aircraft were supposed to avoid enemy fire, not seek it out. Pilots were supposed to survive to fight another day, not deliberately sacrifice themselves as decoys for their comrades. The Wild Weasel mission made no sense according to conventional military logic, but the Wild Weasels understood something their opponents did not. In warfare, the side that accepts calculated risk gains initiative. The side that takes the fight to the enemy controls the tempo of battle. The side willing to do what seems impossible often achieves what others consider unthinkable. First in, last out was not just a motto, it was a promise. The Wild Weasels would go where no one else would go, do what no one else would do, and accept risks that no one else would accept. In return, they asked only that their sacrifices be remembered and their legacy preserved. That legacy endures in every American pilot who flies missions to suppress enemy air defenses. It endures in every tactic and technology descended from the desperate improvisation of 1965. It endures in the institutional memory of an Air Force that learned, through the blood of volunteers, how to fight and win against sophisticated threats. The Soviet advisors who watched American pilots fly directly into SAM fire were right to be shocked. What they witnessed was something new in modern warfare. It was also something very old. It was courage. If you found this account meaningful, please like this video. It helps us share more essential chapters from the Vietnam War and American military history. Subscribe to stay connected with these stories. Each preserves lessons that remain relevant today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, united by commitment to understanding how history shapes the present. Thank you for watching.